welcome, and thank you so much for joining us tonight for our event with Samantha Hunt to celebrate the Unwritten Book, an investigation. We're in for a special treat tonight as Samantha is joining conversation with the author of Belly Up, Rita Bullwinkel. My name is Evan Karp. I'm the events manager for Booksmith, an independent bookstore and mainstay of San Francisco's Haight-Ashbury district since 1976. Without further ado, I'm excited to introduce tonight's stars. Rita Bullwinkel is the author of the story collection Belly Up. She won the 2018 Believer Book Award and a 2022 Whiting Award. Her work has been widely published and translated into Italian, Greek, and Dutch, with both her fiction and translation nominated for Pushcart Prizes. She's an editor-at-large for McSweeney's, a contributing editor for Noon, and the creator of Oral Florist. She lives in San Francisco and teaches at the California College of the Arts. And Samantha Hunt is the author of the story collection The Dark Dark and the novels Mr. Splitfoot, The Invention of Everything Else, and The Seas. Hunt is the recipient of a Guggenheim Fellowship, the Bard Fiction Prize, the National Book Foundation's 5 Under 35 Prize, and the St. Francis College Literary Prize. And she was a finalist for the Orange Prize and the Penn Faulkner Award. She lives in upstate New York. Samantha, we're so thrilled to be with you tonight. Congratulations on the book, and thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us. And Rita, it's always a pleasure. We thank you so much for leading the conversation. I'm thrilled to turn it over to you guys.
Thank you so much, Evan. Thank you for having me. I'm so happy to be here with all of you. And Rita, thank you so much for coming to do this with me. I really appreciate it. It's nice to see you. I'm going to start out just by doing a little reading, and then Rita and I will be in conversation. I'm going to read from the beginning from a chapter called Circulation Desk. The only thing I want to tell you about it a little bit is, like, just the other day, I took a bunch of my students. I teach at Pratt in Brooklyn, and I took a bunch of my students to the New York Public Library, and there was an exhibit there. And part of the exhibit, it was like treasures of the New York Public Library. It's a really good exhibit. It's online too, so those of you folks who are not in New York can see it. But they had one exhibit that was like these little miniature books, and I've always had a real like big problem with miniatures, like a big good problem. Like I just can't get enough of them, and so much so that, like, when I was a little girl, I actually ended up swallowing a lot of my dollhouse furniture because I couldn't stand how wonderful it was. But anyway, so I saw these little books and I thought, oh my gosh, that's basically what I did in the Unwritten Book. I was like, I tried to just kind of like make my own little library to house all of the people who had influenced me. No, well, not all of them. I mean, that would be like a book this big. I don't know, but and so in one way, I almost feel like when I give a reading, I should just read the bibliography, which is long, but maybe that would also be kind of boring. So I don't do that. The other thing that I'll tell you is that one structure I kind of borrow heavily from, or one structure I really rely on, is the Rings of Saturn, and thinking about the structure of the rings as like little ice crystals that are held together. They're separate, they're distinct, but they're together. And I like thinking about that structure, especially in giving a reading, especially a reading where I can't see any of you guys, but just thinking about us all as audience members, like all over the country right now, maybe, I don't know where everyone's hailing from, but, and that we're separate and alone and also together in some way. And a lot of the project of the book was me trying to do that, like to make a connection between things that maybe don't necessarily feel connected at first. Part of that kind of comes out of the house that I grew up in. My parents' house is filled with a lot of really old stuff and a lot of bright color and a lot of things that I'm like, I don't know how that, book of matches from 1957 correlates with, like a jar of vitamins, but I'm going to try to make the connections between those things. Anyways, all right. So here's a little bit from Circulation Desk. And like thinking about that Rings of Saturn pattern, I'm sorry, I'm just going to jump around a little bit so to utterly confuse everybody. Hopefully not. All right, Circulation Desk. The sun will set soon. Birds come to the feeder. Each bird is magnificent. Each bird is weird. How did the birds get so weird? A bright red head, spiky tufts, yellow eyes, pink feet, hidden fluorescence, the ability to fly. How did the word weird get so weird? And my hands, they are also weird. I'm watching the weird world, the weird birds, when a thought arrives from nowhere. What if I've been dead for a long time? What if I've been dead my whole life? If I am dead, the strangeness of existence is momentarily comprehensible. I catch a glimpse or a scent of our dispersed worlds, this place without border, boundary, pain, or punctuation, this place where we are all intimately mixed up with one another. My branch, your book, his leg, her light, all the elements my body and your body have known, a mountain boulder, sediment in the sea, an underground pebble, sand. Everything is ancient, small, and eternal. More birds arrive, more birds leave. My children are playing in the yard. They jump, shriek, and pretend to be something other than their current forms. I hear them speak, and as if waking, my specifics come to collect my body back into being a mother, sister, daughter, wife, friend, a woman who is alive, reading a book outside before dusk. In the yard, I shake off enough deadness to go make dinner. My arms feel stronger with the memory of the rocks that make me. But we have been dead a long time. Of bodies changed to various forms, I sing. Our repurposed parts, like Frankenstein's creature, are calcium, potassium, phosphorus, sodium, magnesium, remixed into bodies. Everything is forever. No one's going anywhere. Toni Morrison writes, "It's hard to make yourself die forever." Thich Nhat Hanh says, "I have been a cloud, a river, the air." Cristina Rivera Garza tells us, "I know you from when you were a tree, from those times." Being a human is extraordinary. Being a tree or chickadee or a pile of ash is also no doubt extraordinary. I just don't often remember having been those things. Though I studied geology, the long view of existence, our lives as minerals, is not the story I most often focus on. Rather, I look for and love the drama, the small details particular to one person, the crooked tooth, the bitten nail, the hidden suffering. We mourn the loss of one extraordinary human life, a grandmother, a cousin, a father, a friend. There is exquisite beauty and storytelling in the smallness, reading life and death like a book, start here, finish here. These things that end, humans, winters, childhoods, love affairs, books, they have sharp edges, painful as desire and packed with grief. Their hurt is precious and rich with meaning. It speaks to the work our bodies are really made for, feeling. How do you feel? I feel like a teenage girl. By that, I mean I experience torrential emotions, trying to stay as awake to feeling as a teenage girl might be. In her poem, Some Girls, Alison Luterman writes, "I have learned that some girls are boys, some are birds, some are oases ringed with stalking lions." When I was very young, I had a dream about a small door. Crouching through the door, I passed into a series of scarlet velvety rooms, small, getting smaller, a birth canal in reverse. I know a number of people who have had a similar dream. It gave me terrific comfort. I knew the tunnel contained mystery. In the dream, I never pressed through the tunnel all the way, but rather sat in the small passage, content in the unknowing, hidden. The first time I saw Mr. Morgan's red library, I was reminded of the dream tunnel, and I thought, this must be the place where that tunnel led. The Morgan, or a golden bookstore, some uncanny cranny-filled Athenaeum. I'm a very slow reader, so a vision of death as a place where I'll finally get some reading done is heaven indeed. In death, might we have access to the infinite stacks of books we never got around to in life? Books written by insects, trees, bacteria, and rocks? In death, might we have access to the books that never had a chance to get written? Those books stored in a place whose system of classification escapes recognizable logic, much like the system in the narrow frame of my own body, where Les Fleurs de Mal rubs up against flowers in the attic, rubs up against my undergraduate geology textbook, Willard Bascom's Waves and Beaches. Bascom made me realize that our very human attempts to make language, to label waves in the sea, matter little to said waves. Language making is fascinating, but also absurd, since classification is fleeting. Bascom wrote that in a storm, concepts of wave period and length tend to lose their meaning. Where I live, storms approach out of the mountains and across a wide river. I see them coming from a long way off. The terror they bring is a welcome feeling for me, the possibility of stopping, of newness and chaos. Though climate change complicates my love of storms by adding fear and regret. George Perret writes that Rabbi Simeon finds 70 different meanings for Bereshit in the beginning, the first word of the Torah. Loss of meaning is only a loss if you only have one narrow meaning. In this afterlife library, we'll dissolve back into the many, the microscopic. I'll browse, I'll read, I'll lose concepts of period and length. I'll lose bits of myself in books, in soil, alphabet as molecule, page as ecosystem. Here's the natural science section. Here's poetry. Here's the universe. Skin cells will become dust, flesh, food, bone to stone. Along with every book we never had the chance to read in life, we might find the ghost books too, texts that were never written or never finished, phantom books with invisible and unverifiable Dewey Decimal numbers. The rings of Saturn are far away, 1.2 billion kilometers at their closest. Still, their structure, tiny individual crystals held loosely together in a circular orbit, feels deeply familiar and intimate. Dots and leaps, holes and collisions, bleeding, mingling, messy birth, bumbling, multiverse, stumbling. The rings of Saturn are like the scattered, dusty house I live in, my body. They feel true to the way I've shelled Carl Sagan's Cosmos between my grandma Marcella's diary of 1983, October 20th, permanent wave 230, and a copy of the Reader's Digest that features a disaster narrative my dad edited, Adrift in the South Pacific. Once I wrote a love letter to an artist who builds tremendous spheres. In the letter, I told him everything I thought about Saturn's rings, how distance between our particles of dust and ice might not signify alienation, but rather a kinder plan that allows space for current and mystery to exist between points, between people, between ideas. The nature of longing and tolerance. He never wrote back. I suppose there's a certain mystery to that and a perfect model for unrequited desire. But afterward, when considering his chilly attitude toward our sixth planet, it was easy to not be in love with him anymore. The desire for bodies is rooted in our mortality. The desire for books shares a similar fevered passion with our decomposition. We will never be able to read all the books or love all the bodies. We feel the comfort of our smallness, our minerals, our parts. As with the dust of Saturn's rings, our eyeballs also reside in orbits. Rocks and cones perceive partial information. Our brains concoct the rest to create vision. Sight contains so much imagination. One wonders if the view of a mountain is fiction or nonfiction. All this to ask, where should I begin when writing a book about birds, words, books, death, hormones, collections, desires, letters, booze, family, birds? A circle starts where, or more to the point, a circle ends where? I have lost my mind to books. That is also true. I sometimes study a book to the point of obsession. I paw at it until I've worn through the very fabric of sanity. Sometimes it's fun, like being addicted to crosswords. The universe is filled with clues, even if it's not. What I mean is, there's an owl outside my house at 3 a.m. talking to another owl. I imagine the nature of their conversation, but I bet I'm wrong. I haven't yet learned the language of the birds. That's okay. Delusion can be close to revelation. Birding delights me. Believing delights me. It's a game. It's artifice. It's art. Barry Holston Lopez writes of the great blue heron, "If you will not speak, I will have to consider making you up." One daughter asks me, "Where is your dad?" I tell her, "He's a cardinal now," a story my siblings and I came up with after he died, something to make death bearable and visible. Like a bird? Yes, I say. And then sometimes we have 4 or 5 cardinals in our yard at the same time. It's not magical deduction. It's not supernatural. It's reading. My mom lost her wedding ring. She does that regularly as her house is complicated by an abundance of stuff. She's an artist. Some people might use an ugly word to describe my mother's home, but it's a bad word. She hates the word, and I won't use it here. Imagine instead the hole that swallowed that word. My mom says, "I know I shouldn't be so attached to objects then. Can you look in your house? Maybe I left my ring at your house." I have my own problematic attachment to objects, especially books. She asks my dad to help her find the ring also. He's been dead for decades, but after she asks him, she finds the ring in a coin purse under a bag of hangers in her hall. I have no idea how it got there, she says. Maybe I shouldn't be so attached to objects either, but everyone keeps dying, leaving stuff behind, objects I can't usually get rid of, and I enjoy the company of the dead. They are so quiet. They know things I don't know. The dead leave clues, and its life becomes a puzzle of trying to read and understand these mysterious hints before the game is over. Even if these clues are not coming from the dead, even if I'm making the whole thing up. In this room where I'm working right now, an ant collects the bodies of her departed brethren, creatures I squished earlier. Accidentally, I try to tell myself, though I know better. What will she do with the bodies of her dead? The ant is a hard worker. Me too, I tell the ant. Ants have undertakers, those members of the community charged with collecting the dead into middens to keep disease away from the colony. Also, because ants use chemical pheromones to communicate. A dead and decomposing ant might release chemical pheromones without sentient intention. Imagine the confusion. Imagine what mixed messages a decaying dead ant might broadcast, or, for that matter, a dead aunt. In this room where I'm working now, a different room from the previous paragraph, my family is sheltering in place to stop the spread of a virus. Our new intimacy with death does not feel calm and wise. It is often marked with fear. Last week, a woman in a parking lot would not stop screaming at me. She was so stressed out. People were hoarding groceries. People were fearful. She was trying to care for an elderly mother in a wheelchair. I tried to help, but I could not find a way past her stress. We were too close. Our hearts beat too fast, a tempo of panic. One friend lost her father and mother to the virus within a few days of each other. Death often does not behave the way I want it to. A woman in my town, mother to 3, ended her life this week. And death sometimes takes children. Death leaves the living raw and ruined. I grabbed at the empty air for weeks and even months after my father died, trying to catch a trace of him in the skein of my fingers. Nothing there. Mary Oliver writes that she thinks our world is the prettiest world, so long as you don't mind a little dying. But we do mind. It hurts. James Baldwin writes that white Americans do not believe in death. He writes, perhaps the whole root of our trouble, the human trouble, is that we will sacrifice all the beauty of our lives, will imprison ourselves in totems, taboos, crosses, blood sacrifices, steeples, mosques, races, armies, flags, nations, in order to deny the fact of death, which is the only fact we have. It seems to me that one ought to rejoice in the fact of death. I have no authority to write about the dead, as I have not been dead, at least not that I remember. My work is absolute appropriation, total conjecture. For this forgery, perhaps I'll face some sort of zombie tribunal, a scolding and retribution. The dead will demand an apology. The dead will revoke my tenure. How, the dead will ask, did you think you could speak for us? Dirty traitor, indeed. I'll point out that they don't do much talking, and I'm not speaking for the dead. I'm only trying to read alphabets and signs they left behind. Maybe I'm a bad reader. Maybe I'm ignorant. Faced with their steely silence, I'll plead senselessness. It's true, my love of language, words, books, humans, my love of being alive has driven me almost mad, seeing things that don't exist, constructing an endless library, an infinity archive, a forest, where in beginning we end, in the end we begin. Thank you. Thanks, guys.
Oh my gosh, Samantha, such a joy to hear you read from this magnificent, luminous book.
Thanks, Rita.
I swallowed it whole, much like perhaps one of your miniatures. I really did, though. I completely devoured it twice over. And I'm so glad you read from this part, because one of the first things I wanted to ask you about was your just incredible table of contents, which, for the benefit of everyone here, I'm gonna see if I hold it up. So it's a table setting, and it's ingenious because it makes the sections have to sit next to one another and perhaps talk to one another, and then it creates this true sense of this book of continuum. And when I happened upon, over the course of reading this page, the table of contents, I was just so struck, and I was wondering if you'd be willing to talk a little bit more about that decision.
Sure. Yeah. So I stole that idea from the painter Amy Sillman, who she's got these amazing pen and ink pieces that are seating arrangements, and but the kind of people at her tables are like neurotic artist is next to dread of death, and they're really pretty funny, but also like really astute observations. And I'm not sure actually if Amy took them from actual dinner parties that she was at, or was just imagining these sittings. But her pen and ink work always stayed with me. And I thought, when I was trying to assemble this book, I don't know, there's something about putting things into a linear order. I mean, back to like what I was saying about the Rings of Saturn, I guess sometimes putting things in a linear order is really upsetting to me, because it does feel like start here, end here. It does feel like a linear path through life is not necessarily how I view it. And it's not necessarily like the happiest narrative. It's like one of the ways that we've come to think about that death that fills me with such dread. And so I really was reluctant to set the book in an order that felt like here's where it starts and here's where it ends. Now, I know that's like a silly thing to say because a book is it's a linear property, you know, but I kind of hoped with that table of contents that the reader might be able to feel like how I felt about the pieces, which was really like, woo, toss them up in the air, you know, and they can all be in conversation with each other. And the other thing I kind of tried to do to promote that conversation between the pieces is that I did structure it a little bit like a work of reference. There's a dictionary that is really important to me, the Dictionary of Word Origins that belonged to my dad's, and I found it after he died. And I used it for a long time. I still kind of do use it as an oracle, as a, like, you open it up and this dictionary is so kind of strange and bizarre that it's so funny. A friend of mine here's a tangent about that dictionary, but a friend of mine just told me that there's an Amazon review of it that somebody said that he actually has to hide the dictionary from his wife because his wife like believes that he's like having an affair with this dictionary. So people have a strange attachment to this book because it's pretty amazing. But the thing that's really cool is he'll make these word references where you'll like look up the word gynecology and he'll say see banshee, or you look up fashion and he'll say see defeat. And like, so sometimes you don't even have to go to the other word. You're already just like, oh my gosh, fashion, see defeat, whatever, you know. That's not how I feel about fashion, but I'm interested in how he gets there, you know. And so I stole that structure from Joseph Twaddle Shipley, which is the author of that dictionary's name. And I have the pieces talking to each other. So I have the chapters, I'll say like see spirits or see, you know, this other chapter. So not that I actually expect a reader to turn back and go read that section again, but I'm just hoping that it in some way makes the pieces of the book be able to be more circular or a little less linear, a little more like a dinner party.
I love it so much. Yeah, for me, it also gave me the sense that the pieces of the book might have sentient bodies somewhere, or, I mean, of course, each piece is a haunting and has the energy of a ghost, but yeah, I just was so enchanted by that. Of course, you've mentioned here in that response your influence from visual art, and another thing that I found just so seductive about this collection of evidence that you have here, which of course you've subtitled the book an investigation, is that we do get little pieces of visuals, which is always something I delight in a book, and I regret that I rarely see, you know, Sebald gives them to us, the pieces of evidence, the visual pieces of evidence, the ticket stub, those types of things. And you give us, you know, incredible illustrations that you've done, your mother's done, other relatives have done. But the only other author I can think of that deploys them with equal power as you is some of Jesse Ball's books. He'll deploy some images, but I'm interested to know about how the images came into the book, and how you thought about visual pieces of evidence in your investigation into haunting in general, and this specific haunting of being in conversation with the unfinished work of your father.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, a lot of the influence of using the visual comes from Sebald, who is one of the authors who's super, super important to me. And I think that I always almost felt jealous of the fact that he is able to have images in his book, and like you, Rita, I'm always wondering why there's not more of that, you know. Especially when I think about the way that I'm writing, it's oftentimes from an image that has struck me, you know, or something that's stayed with me. And so for this book, because it really did come together like an investigation, right? It really felt like I was making a map, or I was like a detective with an investigation board, right? Like, the way an investigation board gets to be spatial instead of linear, right? Where you have like things in relation to each other. It did feel like that. And so I was kind of like collecting these elements. A lot of them were originally photographs. They were the actual photographs of these things that got drawn. And my editor, who's an incredible person, Jenna Johnson at FSG, she wanted the drawings to have a little more unity, or she wanted the images to have a little more unity. And so she suggested, like, hey, is there an illustrator you want to work with? And my mom's an amazing artist. So at first I just asked my mom, I was like, hey, can you turn all of these images into drawings for me and put them in the book? And she did the lion's share of the drawings. But then my daughters were kind of getting curious about it too. And so there's one drawing from all of them. And then there's a series of images in there that were actually, it's a little bit funny because they're from my uncle who died when he was 8 years old. So I never knew him.
Yeah.
He died in the 40s, but I had found, when I was doing the research for this book, I'd found this box from my grandma, and he had made all these comic books when he was 5 years old called the Funnies book. And they were so beautiful and they were so funny. And he was like, had made multiple copies with the hope to sell them for 10 cents each. And I used some of those illustrations in there too. They're pretty incredible. I loved that idea of publishing something of my Uncle Chucky's too, since I never knew him. And since he died at age 8, I thought, oh, okay. There's something really nice about having his images in there for me.
They're incredible. They're so transportive, those images specifically. I mean, obviously, Samantha, this book circles so many things. And this is a selfish question. One thing that is being circled, I felt like in many of the sections, that was particularly potent to me right now, because I just had a baby 6 months ago.
Congratulations.
Thank you. Is so much the circling of family and what it means to be a mother, and the kind of like unimaginable or incomprehensible weight of everything it entails to bring another human into the world. And something that you put so beautifully, that just now that I have your language, is so true to my lived experience that it's hard for me to believe I didn't have this language before, but of course I did not, is the idea that to birth another human is to create a future death. And that's something that is a piece of language that keeps circling back in the book, and one that every time I encountered it while reading just totally shook me. And I was wondering if you would be willing to talk more about what family making, matriarchy, motherhood, all those big topics that you're just so magnificently circling here, how you were thinking about them while you were writing.
Yeah, thank you. And congratulations on that. I think that I didn't realize until I became a mom. I didn't have that sense of anything circular going on in my life. I kind of just was ambitious and wanted to get on with the living, like I felt like, oh, there's the big world and I just want to go explore it. And so I didn't spend much time looking back, and I didn't spend too much time moving slowly. And, stupidly, I regret that now, but that's not part of it really. But so that idea, when I became a mom, I had some pretty serious postpartum anxiety, actually, not so much the depression, but the anxiety. And I was really like having some crazy thoughts, and they were all circling around death. And so a lot of writing this book came out of like trying to find a new way to think about death, because I couldn't stand the bad stories that I was able to tell myself about it. And you know, and a lot of that comes with the vulnerability of making a life, is to you know, have to sit with that idea that I made a death. And I guess what I'm trying to say is that when I was younger, I didn't care so much about, I was kind of like, well, I'll die, that's okay. But as soon as I became a mom, that was not okay. Suddenly I was like, I must control everything, I must hold on to their life, to my life. And that level of control is really hard and really misery making to live with, you know, because you're not going to stop anybody from dying. You can't. And I think that a lot of moms don't know that. They think they can stop their children from dying, you know, and they can't. And so I think that I was troubled by the narrative of like, you made a life, you made a life, you made a life, and not hearing or not having anybody tell me, listen, it's also really intense to make a death. And if you want to talk about that, here I am, you know. And so, yeah, so I guess I just want to start writing more honestly about the real emotions that surround motherhood, because of course there's much celebration and of course there's much joy. But the language we use for mothers is of course incredibly demeaning and incredibly light, lite, and it doesn't go into the idea of us as, you know, the makers of death, which is a pretty intense, you know, subhead to have on your name. But so in that way, yeah, so I tried to look at that aspect too, not just looking at you know, what's going on with my parents' generation. And I'm fully like right now in that sandwich generation of taking care of my mom and taking care of my children. And so, you know, there's a lot of, there's a lot, it's just a lot. Yeah. But
it just felt like in those sections, I was like, you were beaming into my brain. It was really, I don't know how anyone doesn't experience some type of postpartum anxiety, that we're just totally hammered with
yeah.
all sorts of bizarre, we could start at the hazard stickers on like every single baby thing and go from there.
And just not getting a lot of good information beforehand. Like, I'm like,
yeah, absolutely.
I didn't hear too much beforehand. I mean, maybe I wasn't listening. Maybe people were trying to tell me, but you can't hear. I don't know. Something
else I was interested in is that you, in one of the last sections, you make reference to the fact, again, to the circular nature of the lived experience, but of this book project specifically, and the idea that certainly like the evidence collecting will not end with the completion of this book project. And that felt so true, that certainly when we reached the end, that there was so much more left for you to discover, both, you know, in terms of physical objects, like perhaps future pieces of your father's unwritten book, but also revelations and connections. And I was wondering if there were some particular pieces of evidence that have like come to light since this book has come out into the world that you wanted, that you in your mind add to the project.
Well, this is so strange. So like my mom is trying to kind of clean out the house a little bit right now. And so I just was up there, and they're sitting right on the kitchen table. And it's funny because like her house is so filled with stuff that things just appear sometimes. And there it was sitting right on the kitchen table. And it's this little tiny black book. And it was a book of ideas for short stories that my dad kept in the 1960s when he was living in Brooklyn, like like 4 blocks away from the place where I used to live. And I'd never seen that before. And I was like, oh man, it's like, it was like, like that little bad idea book that every writer keeps around. And he was very, very young. He was like a super young man when he was keeping this. I don't even know if he was a father yet. Oh no, I think maybe 2 of my sisters were alive. I'm not sure, but he was a very young man. And so that I was like, oh boy, if I had had that. I mean, and the other piece of evidence, the things that keep coming in is just the writers who I read, who I'm like, oh, I love that person. I can't believe they're not mentioned in this book, and like, for example, tomorrow I'm teaching Emil Ferris's My Favorite Thing is Monsters. And I had already read that book. I've been reading that book for like 5 years and teaching it for a while. And so I just was reading it again last night to prepare. And I thought, oh, there's so much in this book that I feel like I ingested, and it's in the Unwritten Book, but I didn't ever include Emil Ferris in it. And so things like that, things that I read that keep coming to me. And I think, oh, I need to add an appendix maybe in 20 years.
I was so impressed. Yeah, I mean, I do think, at least my experience of reading books is similar to yours in that it like goes into the soup, and it's very difficult to tell when it's coming back up or how it's coming back up. And one of the reasons why I so loved the appendix of this book specifically, but also that you've like so bravely, done the difficult task of trying to go through the soup of what you've read and pick it out.
See who's in there. Yeah.
Yeah. And then of course, I wonder if this will happen to you, but as I was reading, I was also wanting as a reader to like associatively bring evidence to you in certain, not of course with things having to do specifically with your father's work, but with certain ideas you're circling. And I thought, oh, I wonder if Samantha specifically, I'll bring one piece of evidence that I was like, oh, I wonder if she's specifically seen. Have you seen Peter Greenaway's film The Falls? It was his first film.
Nope, but I'll look at it very soon.
Yeah,
very good.
It's briefly for everyone watching who perhaps maybe are also fans of the film. It is a film about what's called a unknown violent event in which in its documentary style, and somehow the birds have some people have turned into birds. There's a bird language, and there's a specific connection between falling and dying that's made again and again over the course of the film. And this is absolutely something that is so true to the lived experience, and that you are circling so beautifully, both in parts of your father's unwritten book, but then also in everything you bring in with the birds, and how we like pieces of our body or molecules are shared with them in some way, or they have to be, because we're all existing in this very close matter. But yeah, I will be so curious. I think you're going to get a lot of letters of people just from all the little sections you go into of people writing you with things.
Well, I really hope so. And I feel like that's so much a part of it, because I mean, I don't have a sense, like in creating that large bibliography, and in trying to really, it's not like pay homage, but like represent all of the people, or not all, many of the people who have influenced my thinking around these ideas. Like, I'm so grateful to be made up of the multiple instead of the singular. Like, I never want to think of myself, oh, there was just the most beautiful photo essay in the Times Magazine, and the New York Times Magazine, and it was I think it was an essay about pronouns, and there was a person in there who uses they, them pronouns, and they do so because they felt their ancestors. And I was like, wow, that idea. And I was thinking about that idea, and I was looking at these amazing photographs from National Geographic of a gut biome. And the gut biome, you know, it's so beautiful, and it's all of these separate different colors and gorgeousness and things that I don't even understand. And thinking about, you know, that idea of not being a singularity at all is very pleasing to me. And so to look in my body and to be like, all right, there's Zabald, there's Murakami, there's Toni Morrison, there's, you know, whoever else is in there, all of these writers who made me, and not just writers, you know, films or artists. I love that idea. And the other thing I wanted to say too, Rita, about like even the artists and writers who I haven't encountered yet, like this film you're speaking of. I remember having a teacher many years ago say to me, you know, kites were invented at the same time in Korea and Guatemala.
Yeah.
And just thinking about that idea of like, you know, bringing together like that we are, that this is one organism that we're all a part of, right? Merlin Sheldrake, who I write about a little bit in the book, you know, he writes about the fact that we're all lichens, right? And that lichens are multiples, and that we're always lichenizing. And I thought, oh, that's so beautiful. Like this idea of there's never been an individual, right? So when we're all creating our kites at the same time, I like thinking about that idea, especially when it comes to topics that really interest me, like what we're talking about with family and the idea of generations. You know, of course we're having the same thoughts that people have had for hundreds and thousands of years, and you know, part of the joy or part of the game of making art is like to see how our generation will find language to express these things.
Yeah, I can feel those questions in every page of this book, which I just love so much. Just checking in with Evan, our amazing, generous host from Booksmith, that we are more than happy to receive questions from the audience at this time if people want to put them in the chat. I could ask Samantha questions forever, but I'm sure everyone else has really interesting questions too. While you're formulating your questions, I may ask one more question, and that is that. So, yeah, I hate to be. There's so many formal innovations in this book that I am so interested to hear how you came to them, Samantha. But for those in the audience, the sections of the book that are portions of Samantha's father's unpublished, unfinished manuscript, they're annotated with words or phrases that Samantha has pulled out and then associatively shown exactly what comes to mind, all sorts of different things about, and that's how on the page you are literally in communication with your father. So it looks like this, which to me looks a lot like an annotated historical document, but I'm so curious to know how you arrived at that specific structure.
Yeah, okay, that's good. That's so funny. I had this open in my lap, good to show people also.
Oh,
yeah.
wow.
Yeah. I forgot to even explain this, and I'm sorry, but the unwritten book of the title is this. I found 3 chapters of my father's, a book that he had been writing after he died. I found these 3 pages and I kind of like use them as oracle throughout. And the chapters are in this book and then I annotate them. But it kind of came to me, and again, back to the idea of mothering, right? So 2 of my daughters are twins, and I was tandem breastfeeding them. So like, you know, baby here on each boob. And I was like thinking about the symmetry of my body, and I would read while I was tandem breastfeeding. And I was like, gosh, everything else in my body can function 2 sides except for my eyeballs, you know, and it really was frustrating me that I couldn't each boob. And I was like thinking about this Oh, there I am. I was like, couldn't read in that eye, couldn't read in that eye. I wanted to read 2 books because I was like feeling so kind of greedy for books. But this was kind of my hope that maybe other people can read 2 streams of text at the same time. So in one eye, you're reading this, in one eye, and you're reading that, which probably won't work. But I wanted to kind of get in there and insert the text in that way. Although, I hope it's not like an annoying little mosquito. But I couldn't kind of let his text go past without me kind of including why it was important to me there. So I threw it in there.
I love that. It was a pleasure for me to read it that way. All right, we have some questions from the audience, and there's 2 that are closely related, so I'm going to ask them together.
Okay.
One is from Zoe Chin. Zoe asks, I'd love to hear more about your connection to objects. Do you see them as being talismanic? Sometimes I wonder if they retain bits of consciousness on the subatomic level so that objects that belong to loved ones retain some of their essence. And then on a related note, Dominica Giglio asks, do you have particular objects, ephemera, or evidence that need to live near one another in your home? And if so, do they talk to one another or otherwise communicate?
Yeah, I do have a bad attachment to objects also, like my mom that I was kind of writing about there. And it's mostly because I just don't like new things. I don't like to make garbage. I don't like to make waste. I hate going shopping. And because I grew up in this really old house and with a lot of old stuff, I do like to have old stuff around me. So it's not necessarily that I hold on to this stuff. And it is, it's all stuff that's from my dead people. Like my entire studio where I write is filled with stuff from my dead people. And I think they don't feel necessarily talismanic. They just feel comfortable. They just feel like almost like a blessing to have that kind of added just that sort of added life in them, that I can, I sit on my friend Peter's couch and I can feel Peter, or I sit in my friend Dory's rocking chair, and I'm very happy to be in the things that these friends of mine who are gone once owned. And I mean, I guess to some extent it does make for an atmosphere that's ripe with something spirited. I don't know what the word would be. It's not haunted. It's not creepy. It's just something spirited. So yeah, I do have a lot of things that I'm trying to get less attached. I really have been lately trying to sever the spirit from the object, because I know we just can't hold on to everything. And I don't necessarily want to, I don't want to make, I don't want to be passing things on to my kids like, you have to take care of this very important object. I don't want to do that to them. I want people to feel free from stuff. But at the same time, I really like old stuff. I really like old stuff around me. It has a lot more meaning than anything new. Yeah. Thanks for those questions.
And then there's a question from Stacy. How did the pandemic affect the writing of this book, if it did?
I would say in the beginning, the pandemic, like a lot of writers, the pandemic was good for me. And then it became not good. I liked slowing down. I liked staying home. I liked being able to have longer stretches of time to think. I mean, because I was writing a book that very much concerned death, the pandemic had a lot of influence on it, where I guess, in some ways it's often feels like we're grappling with death alone when it enters your life. And it didn't feel that way during the pandemic anymore. It felt like we were all grappling with death. together. And so, so I guess, yeah, the pandemic did probably have a pretty big effect on it. Thanks.
And from Katie, do you think you needed to go through the writing of Mr. Splitfoot before you wrote the Unwritten Book in order to address death in perhaps two different ways, one in fiction, one in nonfiction?
I'm laughing because that's my San Francisco sister.
Oh, amazing.
I mean, my actual sister. That's my actual sister who lives in San Francisco. Yes, totally. Absolutely, Katie. So when I was writing Mr. Splitfoot, I was collecting all these kind of hauntings, these ways that I felt like I was getting haunted. And then I, was done with Mr. Splitfoot and it was over, and I still had this big pile of the ways that I get haunted and all these things that I was thinking about with different ways that people get haunted. And when I was first writing the Unwritten Book, that's what it was called. It was called Hauntings. That was like its working title. And so in some ways, I think of this book as what didn't fit in Mr. Splitfoot in terms of thinking about death. I mean, it became a lot more than that, because honestly, I didn't know in the beginning of writing this book that my dad's book was part of this book. I didn't even have it in there. I was just kind of collecting these ideas of haunting. And by haunting, I just mean like the things that feel like they get stuck in your body, whether that's for good or for bad. Like maybe it's a song by One Direction, or maybe it's
we haven't talked at all about One Direction. Forgive me.
It's okay. That's all right. But maybe it's like a pop song, or maybe it's something, or maybe it's a grief, or maybe it's a trauma, or maybe it's hormones, like all these things, or maybe it's a book that you read when you were a child. But all these things that kind of are in our bodies and we can't get rid of them. Maybe you don't want to get rid of them, or maybe you do, but that was what I started out collecting. And then it became a way of like, all right, how are these all in conversation with each other? And they definitely had to do about like ways that I was thinking about death. So yeah, I do think I had to write Mr. Splitfoot to get to the Unwritten Book. Absolutely. Yeah.
And then we have time for just one more question from Becky Boise, which is, how does it feel to have written this book with your dad? How does it feel to have published him posthumously?
Oh, it feels so good. I mean, my dad never got his work published in life. And so to be able to get his work out there and to have people read it, and he's a very different writer than I am. I mean, our work is really different. I think that our topics are very similar. Like he loved thinking about mystery and unsolved mysteries, but but his approach is really different than mine. And so it feels so wonderful to be able to bring his work out into the world. I mean, and also just thinking about, I'm definitely a writer because of how my parents raised me. I mean, I was so lucky. I grew up in a house filled with literature and art from my parents, and I know that's why I'm a writer. I also grew up in this very large family, and I'm the baby of us, and so I'm got really good at listening and observing, and so in some way, thinking about just that idea of trying to interpret our dad, or trying my interpretation of our dad, it was really important and really kind of fun for me to look back and to look at his stories too, and to see about where they came from, what they brought my life, what they brought my siblings' life. Yeah. Thanks.
Samantha, it has been such a joy to be in conversation with you. Everyone, thank you so much for joining us. If you haven't already, pick up this amazing, gorgeous book from Booksmith. And Evan, anything else we need to do?
Just get the book.
Yeah.
That's it. If you don't have it yet, we do have a limited number of signed copies. Sam was kind enough to sign some book plates for us. Please grab the book. If you don't get it from us, get it from your neighborhood store. Sam, congratulations. This has been really lovely, and what a beautiful book.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you, Evan. Thank you so much, Rita. And thank you to all the folks who are here. I wish we were actually all in the same place, but someday soon we will be again.
Next time, hopefully come
Next
back.
time.
Thank you, Rita. Thank you, Sam, and thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.